Last time we were talking about the emergence of Chinese civilization from prehistory into historic times. The threshold for this takes place with what we sometimes call the Neolithic transition, which is to say a change from patterns of culture, patterns of economic life that were based on hunting and gathering, to the emergence of settled agricultural society. In China, this takes place beginning about 12,000 years ago with the domestication of grain, and then with the higher and higher development of village cultures and a series of early civilizations, particularly in North China, the Yangshao and Longshan cultures, and some other centers, the Liangzhu culture in the southeast and the Sichuan Basin area in the southwest. By about 4,000 years ago, this process of change has brought us to a point where we really move into a different kind of historical time, a time that we can know not only from the archaeological record, although archaeology certainly still remains very important, but where we begin to also have textual traditions, writings about Chinese history by the Chinese people themselves. Critical to this transition, critical to the emergence of a new stage in Chinese history, is the emergence of bronze, the emergence of metallurgical industry, the mining of copper and tin and other metals, and the development of a technology which allows people to refine and smelt and then produce metals like bronze that are very useful, very strong, and give to both the tools, the implements of war, and objects of both beauty and spiritual significance a more enduring quality. The ceramics, the pottery that had preceded this, that had been characteristic of the early cultures, certainly remains in place, but is now supplemented by the emergence of bronze and the adoption of bronze for a variety of purposes. This brings us to the real first historical state in Chinese history, which is called the Xia. That's spelled Xia in the modern Western romanization system, the pinyin system of spelling Chinese words. The Xia. The Xia is referred to as a dynasty by the Chinese. In their traditional historiography, the Xia dynasty is where Chinese history really begins. The Xia itself is actually sort of a transitional period. We don't possess actual written texts from the Xia itself. We do have a lot of texts that talk about the Xia from the next period, but we don't have items that come directly from the Xia itself of a written nature. There is, however, clearly a sharp demarcation that takes place in the archaeological record that indicates the emergence of a very different order of political entity, and this is what we conventionally now refer to as the Xia period. And the Xia period begins roughly 2200 BCE, 2200 years before the current era, a little over 4,000 years ago. The archaeological record of the Xia consists of a number of significant features. Perhaps most imposing, most striking is the emergence of what are called palace forms of architecture. Large structures, large buildings built up on rammed earth platforms. That is to say, rammed earth technology becomes very important not only in the building of these platforms but in building walls around settlements. And this is a technology that involves putting up wooden frames, filling them with dirt, and then using flat stones to ram, to pound down the soil to create a very compressed and firm layer. Then you put in more dirt on top, ram that down, and you build up layer after layer after layer of this very, very tough, resilient material. So building these rammed earth platforms and then walls made of rammed earth surrounding either particular complexes of buildings or entire settlements, this becomes characteristic of urban places in Chinese history, and its emergence at the beginning of what we call the Xia period marks a real shift in settlements. Most people, ordinary farmers, ordinary peoples, continued to live in the partially excavated structures that had been characteristic of earlier times. The palace architecture that emerges is exactly that, or at least apparently that. Buildings which were used for the ruling elite, buildings that were used for ritual or ceremonial purposes, for sort of public functions, not as the dwellings for the vast majority of people. Nonetheless, the appearance of these buildings suggests that there's a further development in the degree of social hierarchy, the degree of social differentiation. The domestication of grain, the development of an agricultural society, of settled communities, what that gives rise to, one of the things that gives rise to, is the development of a surplus. That is to say, more grain, more food is produced than is necessary to sustain the farming population. And what this allows for is the emergence of groups within society who don't engage in farming, who can devote their time and their energies to other activities. Some of these people become artisans, craftsmen, specialists in different kinds of handicraft production. Others perhaps become warriors, military specialists. Some become political leaders, initially probably ritual or spiritual leaders, but eventually, as time goes by, they become more and more purely state-oriented, more political in their nature. The large-scale buildings, the sort of ritual centers that we see in early Xia archaeological sites, were probably used by these newly emerging political elites for the performance of public activities that cemented and legitimized their rule. The performance of public rituals probably was a way for them to display their power, but also for them to sort of perform actions which made people believe in their power, made people accept their power, accept their leadership in society. And it seems that the central feature of this was worship, was a spiritual practice. Early cultures, early communities in China participated in what we sometimes call totemism, a form of shamanism where animal spirits are associated with particular tribal or clan groups of families. The Xia state, if we can call it that, the Xia dynasty, seems to have been a period where the worship of the totems of one particular family is transformed into a sort of royal ancestral cult. That is to say, the spirits not only of nature, but of the ancestors of the present-day rulers came to be seen as divine powers who could affect life in the present world. Okay? The leaders of the Xia appear to have performed public sacrifices in the memory of their ancestors, and perhaps, we don't know this for sure about the Xia, but we'll see how it develops in the next period, the Shang, perhaps engaged in a ritual interaction with the ancestors in which they asked the ancestors for help or for advice in terms of how to deal with the problems of the day-to-day world. One of the centers where this seems to have taken place is a site called Lect02, which is in the west of modern-day Henan province, and possesses one of the most elaborate of the early palace complexes, a number of buildings. These buildings are built with what we call a post and beam system of construction. That is to say, up on the rammed earth platform, a series of upright posts would be erected and then beams laid along the top of those posts, and then a roof built up on the surface or on the top of that. This is a very useful form of architecture for North China. It uses a relatively minimal amount of timber. Timber was not in great abundance, and so you couldn't build big elaborate structures out of wood. But by using this post and beam system, you could create a framework which then could be filled in, often with what's called wattle and daub, a kind of woven organic fibers plastered with mud. And that allowed the walls to be very light, not to have to carry a lot of weight. All the structural weight was borne by the posts. And it allowed you to enclose a fairly extensive interior space. And that allowed a space where people could be assembled inside to observe and perhaps participate in some of these ritual activities. Now, a lot of what we think about the Xia period is based upon a sort of projection back in time from what we know much more concretely about the Shang. There are a lot of features of the Xia and the Shang civilizations that look pretty consistent. The difference being that when we get to the Shang, we have written records. So we have a much more detailed understanding of what goes on during the Shang period. The Shang begins roughly about 1500 BCE. The traditional date, the Chinese have a very elaborate and precise traditional chronology which says that the Shang begins in 1766 BC. But that has not been borne out by archaeological investigations, and so now we use a somewhat vaguer chronology, and if we say around 1500 BCE, that's probably good enough in terms of a starting point for the Shang. What's interesting is that we get fairly quickly with the Shang a historical documentary record. And this is in the form of what we call oracle bones. Now, oracle bones are a really interesting phenomenon. Some of them are literally bones. There's two kinds of objects that are involved in what we call oracle bones. One are the shoulder blades of oxen, which are fairly good-sized bones. The other are the plastrons, the underside shells of turtles, which are also, these were big river turtles in North China at that time. They could also be fairly good size. These shoulder blades of oxen or plastrons of turtles were dried out until they became very brittle, and then they would have little indentations carved in them, and then at the appropriate moment, a sharp, very, very hot object, perhaps a bronze poker. Some scholars believe these may have been thorn branches that were burned and then, just blown out and used. But a sharp object is pushed into this carved little pit or crater on the surface of the bone, and that causes the dry bone to crack. And they cracked in a very specific way that either pointed up or pointed down. And based upon the way that the crack pointed, the bones, the ancestors were believed to have spoken, to have communicated. The oracle bones were produced as part of a royal ritual cult of the Shang, in which they asked questions of the ancestors. They would ask questions of very specific ancestors. They would ask King Cheng, who had reigned 200 years earlier, about a very specific problem. And they asked all kinds of questions. This kind of divination seems to have gone on almost on a daily basis, usually early in the morning. The king would go to a ceremonial hall, and there would be lots of officials, and then it would be the official diviners. And the diviners were the people who could read and write. They were the people who seemed to have deployed the written language. And as I said earlier in the last lecture, when we get a written language, it's fully developed. As soon as we have it in the historical record, it's a fully developed language. We don't have transitional sort of intermediate stages of development in the record. We just have now full text. And what these texts consist of are questions posed to the ancestors, the answers which are read from the cracks, and then, because already the Chinese are emerging as good historians, they write down what actually happened. I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. a particular morning, they might ask, is the harvest going to be good this year? Okay, so they would ask this question, and they would write this down. They would carve this into the bone. Will the harvest be good this year? And then they would crack the bone. The diviner would read the crack, and he would say, yes, the harvest is going to be good, and they would write that down. And then later, after the harvest came in, if the harvest was good, they'd write down, and it was good. If the harvest wasn't good, they'd write down, but it wasn't good. And so they kept a record of questions, answers, and actual outcomes, sort of like they were keeping track of how the ancestors were doing. It's a fascinating set of materials to work with. They did this over and over again, too. They didn't just ask a question once. They would ask it 5, 10 times. And they seem to have taken sort of an averaging approach, that if they got 6 good answers and 6 bad answers, well, that wasn't a very clear outcome. But if they got 8 good answers and only 2 bad answers, then it was probably going to be good. So they kept these records. They recorded all kinds of information. I mean, they asked about whether the queen would have an easy delivery of a child, whether a toothache would go away, whether it was an auspicious time to send off a military expedition. They just asked all kinds of questions to the ancestors. Now, the function of this seems to have been, again, to legitimize, to authenticate the power of the present-day kings. They were not the kings merely because they had control over certain resources or because they were the most scary guys around. They had power. They were the leaders because they could consult with the ancestors, because they had access via this process of divination to the spiritual world. And they could use that access to guide the affairs of the community, to guide the affairs of state. Okay? We know a lot about these oracle bones because they've been dug up in huge quantities in the 20th century. Back in the 1890s, peasants living in the area where these were buried in the ground had been digging them up. They knew there was something important about them, powerful about them, but they didn't understand. They couldn't read the texts. They didn't even know they were texts. And they ground them up and used them for medicine. And it was in a marketplace at a traditional medicine shop that an archaeologist saw one of these and said, oh my gosh, this is really important, and found out where they had come from, and then began the process of excavating them. And now there have been tens of thousands of them dug up, and they've become a tremendous source of information about the Shang period. Now, the royal cult, which was at the center of this process of divination, was also maintained in other ways. The divinations were very important, but there were other ways in which the ancestors could be worshipped that were perhaps equally important. And this is where, to a great extent, the bronze culture comes into play. Ritual bronzes, objects of very great beauty, were produced for a whole variety of particular ceremonial functions. Wine cups that were used to offer libations to the ancestors, which would then be poured out on the ground. Particular kinds of cooking vessels that could be used for cooking grains, other kinds that were used for cooking meat. All these kinds of offerings were prepared and presented to the ancestors. Again, these things, all these activities taking place in these large monumental halls. The sacrifices would be made, the offerings presented, and the ancestors would come, the spirits of the ancestors would come, and they would take the essence, if you will, of the offerings. And then the food that was left, the empty sort of non-spiritual remains of the food that were left, would be consumed in great feasts. This was a way in which the royal family also displayed its wealth and power by hosting these great banquets. Well, the kings, the central players in all this, were the Shang kings. And probably the Shah had operated in the same way, but again, we know very concretely for the Shang, the monarchy was the central institution in this political system. Now, in those days, life expectancy was not very long. Most people probably even in the wealthier, better off parts of society, most people didn't live much past about 30. As a result of this, it was often the case that the ruling king died before his children were old enough to succeed him, before his son, his eldest son even, would be old enough to succeed him. And apparently because of this, the Shang monarchy was not organized on a basis of the kingship passing from father to son. Instead, the kingship passed within a given generation from the older to younger brothers. So in the first generation, or in a given generation, the eldest son would be the king, the eldest brother would be the king, and then if he died, his younger brother, his next younger brother would become king, and when he died, perhaps even his younger brother might become king, sometimes 3 kings in a single generation. When the last died, the eldest son of the eldest brother would become the king. So it would sort of go parallel for a while and then kick back over to the eldest line. And this went on for a number of generations there. I think something like 26 kings in the course of the Shang period. The Shang also built royal capitals. The Sha model, the city of, or the settlement at Arlito, where these early palaces emerge in the Sha archaeological record, were continued under the Shang. The Shang built fairly large capital cities, but they didn't seem to stay in them a very long time. The Shang period lasts 5 or 6 centuries, and in the course of that time, they had 9 capitals. So they seemed to move them with a fair degree of regularity, although the last of the Shang capitals at a city, a small town, a small city today called Anyang in Henan province, seems to have remained the center of the Shang state for the last 200 years of its existence. So perhaps they were settling into a more permanent capital center. The Shang was a federation of peoples. That is to say, there were the people formerly known as the Shang, who were the ruling family, and people who were linked to them by various ties of blood, people from the same clan, the same tribal grouping. But there were other peoples who were not blood relations of the Shang, not members of the same tribal order as the Shang, who were part of the Shang state, part of the Shang, I suppose we could say, empire. And these people formed a sort of periphery around the central territory of the Shang. What united them, what they had in common, was their participation in the royal cult, their participation in a literate civilization. Reports would be sent in from various parts of the territory that were written down. Communications from the king to his subordinate leaders were written down. So it's a state which now operates on the basis of written communication, not only the oracle bones and the maintenance of divination records, but the day-to-day operations of governance were carried out using a writing system. It was a fairly elaborate system. And perhaps the best way to get a sense of the high degree of sophistication of the Shang state is to think about the metallurgical industry. The bronze objects that were used in divination, that were used in the ritual cult, were, as I say, very elaborate, very beautiful objects. They were cast objects, that is to say, molds were made, and then molten bronze was poured in. It's a very sophisticated kind of technology. The whole metallurgical industry involved mining, smelting, refining, blending different metals together to produce the right kind of bronze, the design of the objects, the making of the molds, the pouring of the objects, finishing them. All this was organized by the Shang state. It was officially run. And that involved the organization of large numbers of people. It involved activities at a number of sites. The mines were not in the same place as the centers of Shang civilization. We know from the excavation of the last Shang capital at Anyang that there were huge workshops, forges, places where the metal was cast, all kinds of settlement areas where the craftsmen, the artisans who worked in the different phases of the metallurgical industry were housed. A very elaborate system, clearly organized and administered very effectively by the royal state. To do that required both managerial skills, but it also required a capacity to feed people, to clothe people, to house people, which meant that all these things had to be paid for. And this is how we know that the Shang had an elaborate taxation system. We know from, again, from the divination records and from other inscriptions from the time that so-called tribute payments were made by the various subordinate peoples who were part of the Shang polity. And these, in effect, were taxes. These were ways in which the royal center drew from the peripheral settlements the wealth that it needed to sustain its military infrastructure and the metallurgical industry. And of course, the metallurgical industry was critical to its maintenance of its own legitimacy, its own public authority. All right. Now, this system functioned pretty smoothly for a long time. We know, again, from the divination records that the peoples outside of Shang civilization, the so-called barbarians, who lived north, south, east, west, all around the Shang, were a constant concern. The diviners are frequently asking the ancestors for advice. Should we launch an expedition to punish the people in the east? Should we expect that the barbarians from the north will raid at harvest time? All kinds of concerns, all kinds of anxieties are in evidence in the questions that are asked. And we know from the answers and from the outcome statements that there were frequent devastating raids, that non-Chinese peoples intruded into the settled areas, intruded into the agricultural heartland, and carried off not only food and other kinds of supplies, but people as well were taken away and enslaved in these non-Chinese areas, or these non-Shang areas. So the maintenance of security was one of the critical functions of the Shang state as well. In that function, they ran into some problems as time went by. And these problems had to do with mobilizing resources and deploying force to secure the state, to secure the territory, but that generated tensions and unrest within the Shang territory itself. What seems to have happened is that subordinate peoples, and there were many of them, became resentful as time went on of the tribute that they paid to the Shang rulers, particularly as security around the perimeter of the Shang territory seemed to be breaking down. If they were going to be paying tribute, if they were going to be offering up wealth to the Shang kings, then they expected to live in secure and stable conditions. But increasingly, as we get down to about the 11th century BC, those conditions were not being maintained. That led to unrest and frustration among the people, among many of the subordinate peoples who constituted the Shang polity. And that unrest eventually led to efforts by some of those people to overthrow the Shang and to establish their own power in succession, just as the Shang had emerged as the successors to the Xia. We'll turn our attention to the overthrow of the Shang and the emergence of the next dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, in the next lecture.